So this is the third in the series, Autopsy of the Left. The first two are on Vimeo, I think. So I've been at this for a while. But the point here is that I'm taking it for granted that I'm talking to somebody who is aware that the left, Marxism, is over 200 years old, that it became a world phenomenon, especially from the beginning of the 20th century, and that it went through a lot of twists and turns, which were not predicted by the original doctrine. Then we had the much publicized collapse around the the end of the 20th century. The entirety of Eastern Europe, I guess. I think that's right. And then we have sort of the left has continued as a as a segment of public activism, but the premises are, I mean, to me, are unrecognizably different from the premises of Marx's project. I mean, whatever you think of that, it's just not the same thing. I would say that we have actually ended as a coalition of essential victims, at least in the United States. That's the way that I would describe what is thought of as the left landscape in the United States. I mean, the idea of, that you have African American separatists sort of in the same pew with homosexuals, with women, and that means all women, and and Hispanics, and so forth and so forth and so forth. I mean, this was actually a conscious reconfiguration. I mean, in which the original idea, I assume some or most of you know, is that the proletariat was supposed to be the revolutionary protagonist, and the proletariat dropped out as the revolutionary protagonist a long time ago. I mean, that was the entire third world phenomenon that came in. I mean, if you want to talk about when the third world phenomenon actually intersected with the Third International, I mean, that would be the 1920, I guess the 1920 Congress of the Third International in the Soviet Union, and Lenin's big quarrel with Roy, who was an Indian communist, who said that, it's going to be about people of color. It's not about the proletariat. And I mean, you have that, and perhaps climaxing with Guevara's speech at the United Nations in 1964. I mean, that is, I think, would be considered absolute classic as a formulation of a third world project, if you will. That is sort of what Guevara said in December 1964 at the United Nations. And then some of you may know Guevara tried it with disastrous results, but he did try. First in Africa, then in Bolivia. And Eduardo Mondlane did not try, he didn't try anything more ambitious than what he would call the liberation of Mozambique. But he did try that. He was successfully assassinated by the Portuguese secret police. Those were, I mean, they were probably intoxicated with the precedent of China. I mean, China gave them maybe a lot of exaggerated ideas about what was possible. Guevara actually thought that the Great Leap Forward should be tried in Cuba. And I mean, that tells me that he did not know what the Great Leap Forward actually was. And it makes me feel a little better about the fact that I didn't know what it was. I mean, apparently, the fact that it was, the largest mass murder in history. That's the only way that it can possibly be described. But I guess that did not become general knowledge until much later. Although, any historian now has the information. The estimates of the number of deaths range very widely from 11 million to 45 million. But at any rate, this is a long way around to say that I assume that we are looking now at a landscape on which the left has collapsed or has been completely humiliated. In terms of, for example, what is the latest news from China, the stock market crash? That's what I'm talking about. So, my first point is there has to be a stock taking. There has to be a settling of accounts. We have to draw strategic conclusions from this massive historical experience. Now, I immediately run into two pushbacks here. One of them is that some of the vestigial Marxist, splinter groups and so forth and so on, they don't even admit that anything ever went wrong. For them, it's just like old times, they still unconditionally defend Russia, on the grounds it's the same thing as the Soviet Union, for example. I don't think that a lot of people find that credible, but just for completeness, I have to tell you that there are a few people who are still talking like that. And of course, they give China a red-hot bill of good health, and they say that this stock market crash, just don't pay any attention to that. I don't find that very plausible and very worthy of a reply. But there was another thing that I was told, and that is somebody objected to me saying that that I'm the only person who has commenced this stock taking or this settling of accounts. And he told me that there are thousands of books on this topic. Really? And so who would be one of the authors? Zizek. Now I have to tell you what I think about that. In the first place, if somebody thinks that Zizek has already done it, then I don't want to talk to him. That's the first point. The second point is that a few of you may know, I am a veteran of the dogmatic left, the doctrinaire left. I spent, quite a few years with that, and it would seem to me that somebody, who went through my experience, in the first place, at that time, this may be like, so long ago that it just sounds unreal now. If you look at what the splinter groups are saying now, they don't really make any pretense of saying anything that is intellectually defensible. But we were different. In the 1960s, we claimed, we certainly hoped that our analysis was correct. In the sense that we were anticipating events that, establishment commentators would not anticipate. That's what we thought, whether it was true or not. The establishment commentators had not predicted the Soviet Union. It was just completely off the map. You can't show me any respectable, right after the beginning of the 20th century, you can't show me anybody who was respectable. Maybe, Spangler had some cynical remarks, maybe, but in other words, they had, that's just not good enough. They were not specific to what the Soviet Union was. But we claimed that we had an intellectually defensible analysis, and that we have to sort of take, contemporary events by the throat, so to speak. I mean, because if we had failed to judge them correctly, there would be no basis for our organization. That's the way that we thought. I just remember that very clearly. I mean, you don't just let, the death of communism, or whatever they call it, is arguably the most significant event in the history of civilization. I mean, that's what I would say. And you don't just let something like that go. But I would expect that a former cadre would be heartsick that there is no, that in the public arena, I mean, for the big guns, what I'm calling the big guns, that they have nothing, that is even remotely to the point, about this situation. It's not so much that, in other words, like we knew that the Soviet Union, that there might be a problem with the Soviet Union. We debated that in the 1960s. I mean, in fact, the Progressive Labor Party already said that the Soviet Union was capitalist in 1966. And then Mao said it in the early 70s. So, that was not shocking, but what would be shocking would be that you have this vast, panoramic, unprecedented chapter of history, and that, nobody is taking it on as such. Then, the last thing that I have to say about that, on that particular point is that, if it is really true, that people are satisfied with Zizek, and that they think that he's taking care of this, and now we can turn off the lights and go home, then, that's the worst political news I think that I've ever had. That, in other words, that means that people just don't care. That's a symptom of a dying civilization or something. When people just stop caring, or just are willing to accept buffoonery, in lieu of a serious, responsible analysis. So there is that. Let me go on and I want to start into this. I've already used up a lot of the time that I gave myself. There's no way that I'm going to get through all of this. But let me, try to give you a taste of it, and let me see if there's any point in just giving you topics without filling them out. But I wanted to say that there are some insights of Marx that I do respect now, that I think are stimulating. The idea that present life, contemporary life, is about money, which comes through very, very powerfully in the 1844 manuscripts. I think that is absolutely brilliant. And Marx was not just saying that that it's about goods, objects, merchandise, or something like that. What Marx was saying was that commodification has penetrated your psyche. That, in other words, you come to think of your own, consciousness, or whatever you want to say, your own personality as a commodity. And your relationships with other people have, an essentially monetary money. Marx really went to town with marriage. It was very easy for him, I guess, in the first half of the 19th century to really do a satire on marriage. But that's what he says that, that the groom actually ought to marry a sack of money, because that's what it's about. If you actually read that, by the way, I just can't resist saying that, you know, I'm really offended if somebody tells me that Zizek is on the level of the 1844 manuscripts. I mean, in my opinion, there's absolutely no comparison. Then Marx speculated that the manufacturer extracts a surplus from the immediate producers without recompense. In order to explain that, I have to tell you what legitimate economists, how they analyze slavery and serfdom. I mean, legitimate economists say that basically slavery and serfdom, I'm abstracting from the differences between the two, which are very important, but for this purpose they're the same thing. That the producer simply supplies the slave or the serf with whatever is needed to keep him or her alive. And I mean that, you know, like if you want to think of that as a wage, even though it isn't, but it's not a wage at all. But if you want to think of it like that, then know that wage is kept at subsistence. The slave or the serf does their thing, and then the producer takes it all. Period. And I think that academic economists would agree with that. When we come to capitalism, then, you know, like you hit a wall of academic economics. I mean, at that point, they could not disagree more. But and Marx's thesis is difficult to defend theoretically. I will certainly acknowledge that. But for me, I mean, it has a prima facie credibility. I mean, I think in particular Cone Mills in Asheville, North Carolina at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, I guess it was a perfect example of a town that was dedicated to a mill, to a producing enterprise. And I'm sure that the mill workers were paid subsistence. I mean, they were paid what was required to keep them, you know, coming back to work the next morning. That was the wage level. And, you know, then, I mean, of course, the owners, of course, got massively wealthy. You know, how is this miracle possible, you know? I mean, that's what has to be explained. That's what Marx was, Marx was, you know, like his central question for capitalism is, where does profit come from? And so that's what he was trying to explain. It was actually a little bit more complicated in the case of Asheville because Cone Mills also owned the stores where the workers bought their supplies. So, I mean, you could pay them a little more, you know, in the certainty that it would just come back to you know, when they spit it in your store. You know, so, capitalism has all of these, all of these circuits, and everything like that make it much more difficult to analyze. But I finally decided, I did some work on that, and I finally decided that the concept of, sort of the amount of money that a particular manufacturer, quote unquote, steals from his workers is not really that important in the larger scheme of things. I mean, some people have worried about that, but the point is that let me jump right on. I'll come back and pick something up. But in other words, like what is the solution to the social problem? Marx, for whatever reason, and the 1844 manuscripts of the German ideology are sort of very clear anticipations of this, and then he comes back and he picks it up in a way that is not as vivid in the Gotha program. For whatever reason, Marx jumped directly, to the end game. And then Che Guevara comes back, and he is obviously intoxicated, with himself and with a lot of reading that he has been doing. And he says all of these utopian things that don't really square up with the situation that he's actually speaking from. But he says, man produces without being compelled by the physical necessity of selling himself as a commodity. That's what, this is where Marx wanted to get to. Guevara wanted the complete elimination of money, interest, commodity production, the market economy, and mercantile relationships. Well, that is sort of the, that would be the destination that Marx propounded at the beginning of his life. He believed that history is a staircase of modes of production, and that previous modes of production are defined by sort of who does the work and who's the owning class, or the class that actually appropriates the output of the production. So Marx had this very well-known scheme, primitive communism, slavery, serfdom, capitalism, and that was supposed to be followed by communism. The point is that Marx saw the destination here as a mode of production. That is so profoundly different from the kind of thinking that is in public discourse today, and I must say, from the way that you have been taught to think. You have not been taught to think that that there is a social problem which will be made to go away by the passage to a different mode of production. In which the owning class, the owning class that we have now will disappear, and something else will be going on. That is just not the way. People. One of the things that I did preparing for this was to look up foundations in the United States that make donations to left organizations. And every single one of them has like a Robin Hood template, and they have, they all use terms like community organizer, grassroots, and so forth and so on. It's like you're going to go among the poor, and you're going to be with the poor, you're going to sit on the curb and weep for the poor. And, the solution of the problem is that you're going to sort of extort some of the money from these fat cats, and somehow give it to the poor. And that's the solution of the problem. As far as I know, this is now, this is a complete truism in public discourse. Left, being on the left is a theatrical bit. Like you have a left jamboree. Like that means that people are going to come in and they're going to talk about the time that they're spent sort of, working with the poor, building a wall, and settlement houses and so forth and so on. And then, like they're going to come up with one or another idea of snatching some money from a fat cat and giving it to the poor. And why don't they, why doesn't somebody notice that presupposes that you will always need the fat cats to create wealth? That's where all wealth comes from, the capitalists. The bigger the better. And, the most that you can do to achieve social justice, which is another one of their catchphrases, is to get a little bit of that money away, and put it in the beggar's tin cup. That is not the perspective that Marx said that he had. I mean, his idea was that there was no longer going to be any private ownership of the means of production. And, I mean, once we get beyond that, we start getting into, you know, like aspects where Marx's scheme could not possibly have worked. And, you know, I am prepared to spend a lot of time on that, but I don't know if we'll be getting into that today. But so let me just jump right into what I'm calling here Marx's disastrous miscalculations. Crackpot materialism. I don't mean by that Marx didn't come out for one of the ancient religions. That's not what I mean by him being a materialist or a crackpot materialist. What I mean is something much more sophisticated and ontological. I mean, Marx, everybody who would have said that he was a scientific philosopher, or that he approached philosopher scientifically, right up until, you know, like maybe even up until 1950. I mean, all the scientific materialists and so forth, not just Marx. I mean, they assume that, you know, that objective reality, you know, that you should identify objective reality with objects in the world. And what is an object in the world? Well, it's a rock. You know, something like that. I mean, something that is ponderable. You know, I mean, it's ponderable, you know, I mean, you can pick it up and bash somebody's head in with it. You know, it's substantially continuous, you know. I mean, like, in other words, I mean, if you heated it enough, it would become plastic, but at normal temperature, you know, it's solid and so forth and so on. I mean, that was their picture. That's objective reality. And I mean, none of these guys dreamed that we would ever come to a point where we would say that algorithms are objects in the world. But that's where we are right now. I mean, you know, the program that runs your body, you know, I mean, you know, at some level it's an algorithm. It's language. You know, I mean, it can be abstracted, as we all know. I mean, it can be abstracted and written as a program. And, I mean, they had no idea whatsoever that anything language-like could be an object in the world. I mean, they thought that all language was a human convention. I mean, they had no idea that there were already languages you know, like, I mean, in our bodies, for example. The reason why that is such a big problem for Marx is because he had, I mean, in other words, like his idea of production was like Jack Armstrong standing at the good old lathe, you know, the good old lathe, you know, in the good old Rust Belt factory. I mean, that was it, you know, clink, clink, and clunk, clunk, you know, get to work, and so forth and so on. I mean, they're talking now about all robot factories. I mean, Marx didn't dream of them. But, I mean, and the other thing that he did not dream of is that you actually need those all-robot factories in order to do what he said he wanted to do. I mean, you're not going to do it with human labor, you know, human workers standing at clunk machines. I mean, that is actually syndicalism. I mean, if you happen to know the word, I mean, what Marx did was to take syndicalism and he pasted that together with authoritarianism. The authoritarianism is very clear in some places. The syndicalism sort of runs throughout. But, you know, at the time of the Paris Commune, I mean, Marx thought that, you know, that people could just sort of declare themselves, you know, like, okay, you know, like this is the new social order or something like that. But we're still standing exactly where we were before, you know, we're ordinary workers, you know, sort of going into the factory the same way that we did before. Everything like that. The only difference is that we now have a lot of committee meetings. It could not, I mean, they're actually in Spain they actually have a major worker-owned factory. It's famous among people who make that sort of thing seriously. But, I mean, it is slowly devolving into an ordinary capitalist enterprise. I mean, of course it will. Of course it will. I mean, you can't have an enclave, consisting of a worker-owned factory. That's complete nonsense, if I may say so. But let me see. So another disastrous assumption that Marx made was that capitalism becomes socialism inevitably. I mean, in other words, history is a staircase. There was no way to go but, up from slavery to feudalism, up from feudalism to capitalism, up from capitalism to socialism. I mean, Marx deeply believed that capitalism itself was engendering all of the pieces of the socialist puzzle. I mean, including the assembly of armies of labor in factories. And they didn't even have what we call common stock. I mean, they didn't have that in the first half of the 19th century. That had to be invented. When it was invented, that Engels was ecstatic. I mean, he said, this proves that that ownership does not have to be vested in one man. But the real problem with this, there's something much deeper here, and the idea that, it was just like sort of one big river flowing inevitably to socialism. The real problem there was that there always is what I call vernacular defiance. Vernacular defiance. I mean, what we communists call the immediate struggle, the partial struggle, the immediate struggle. I would also call it the incremental struggle, But in other words, these incremental struggles, do not come out, with a copy of Capital in one hand, and Lenin's State and Revolution in the other hand. That's not where they come from. I mean, most of them they come from religion, and they frequently are religious cults. I mean, they have a particular way of understanding themselves, which has absolutely nothing. I mean, it is actually 180 degrees from, Marx thought that secularism was a hard-won principle that he had to fight for. He also thought that the mode of production was a hard-won principle. I mean, he would have been annoyed by people who thought that, charity on the part of the rich is a solution, provides social justice or something. I mean, he would have said, this is all nonsense. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't even know what commodification is. I mean, you're treating the poor as if they're an ethnic group, and as if it is their fate to live on charity. And as if it is desirable for the population of the poor to increase. Think about that. I mean, that's what I call politics of the poor. That's what you got in Venezuela with Chavez. I mean, if the politics of the poor is successful, then, when it is over, there will be twice as many poor as there were before. Because it's like an ethnic group. I mean, you want them as a voting bloc. In this particular case, Marx was so confident that that socialism would sort of sweep everything along with it, that he was willing to conciliate, or to play around with what I vernacular defiance. I mean, we can make a very long list of vernacular defiance because, you have it in every society all of the time. The Nation of Islam, the move in Philadelphia. Let me see, gay marriage. And I could go on and on and on in this. Oh, yes, here's a terrific example. In Detroit right now, there is some sort of, there's a clash between Uber and I guess on the other side is the medallion cabs, I guess that's what I should call them. But somehow the left has decided that Uber is bourgeois and medallion cabs are proletarian. So they have taken up the struggle of the medallion cabs against Uber, with the idea that this is like some piece of the communist revolution. And that if this enterprise is carried forward successfully, then we will wake up to a communist society. But this sort of whole vernacular defiance and, the immediate struggle, the idea that you add one partial struggle to another partial struggle and you keep on adding them and they finally add up to socialism. Well, anybody who knows anything about Kabbalah knows exactly where that's coming. It looks so much like it, that you can't not see it. But at any rate, the problem for this is, already in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says that communists support every immediate struggle, every partial struggle. Even though we retain our goal in the distant future. This just keeps coming back. This is the premise of the entire Third World movement, that occupied the world for some decades. For many decades. Because, it was the idea that, the Third World struggle was going to be a partial struggle undertaken by a country which was not even capitalist. In other words, the idea was to sort of bring it up to a capitalist level. That had not been done, So, the idea was that they would use communism as, a modernization strategy of last resort. Terroristic forced accumulation, or terroristic primitive accumulation. There both is and is not some truth to that. The Chinese could claim that, if there comes a day when the Chinese government says, we're now capitalists, just forget what it's gone before. We're capitalists, we won. In other words, we're bigger than you. In other words, like you, we own all of your debt. It's like you're toast. We won. But the payoff is capitalism. At that point, they wouldn't even, there's no reason to keep up the pretense of being communist. Nevertheless, the amount of killing, which was involved to get them to that point. Public discourse ignores that. I can't ignore it. In other words, like if somebody has a so-called moral theory, and they just shrug that off, as a non-event or something like that, then I don't know what that does to their moral theory. In other cases, of course, the idea of communism as the modernization strategy of last resort was an unmitigated disaster, like Ethiopia and Eritrea, Cambodia, Zimbabwe, I would say so. But at any rate, that is I mean, it's a disaster for what Marx said he wanted to do. In other words, if you're willing to live at the level of vernacular defiance, the so-called immediate struggle, I just don't have anything to say to you. Obviously, the Italian cats in Detroit, obviously, they're very happy with their immediate struggle. They don't want to be told that this is not going to get you 1 millimeter closer to a new mode of production. They think that they can win that they can hold Uber off. That's what they're trying to do. It reminds me of printers who were trying to hold what automation or whatever it was off, and keep the hand-operated linotypes going, usually those struggles end in defeat, as a matter of fact. I've actually covered a lot of this. In fact, I actually started out by saying that I think that the point that we are today, it's no longer the Third World Revolution. The Third World Revolution has been put back in the closet. I don't know if somebody like Malik Shabazz is still talking Third World Revolution in the United States. Outside of the United States, the governments want Western capital. Period. That is their premise. That's what they think, economic progress, like Nigeria. Nigeria would be my first case in point. They want Western capital. There's no more of this nonsense, about dropping out of the international economy and going back to some primitive methods of production. That's over. You couldn't get anybody, Guevara couldn't get anybody to take that seriously in the Congo in 1966. That's part of the reason why, he died young. Because, I guess they just instinctively realized that it didn't make any sense. At any rate, we come today, to the coalition of essential victims. They're essential victims because the presumption is that these victims will always be on the defensive. Homosexuals will always be on the defensive. They will never be a majority. They will always be 2% or less of the population. That's the premise. They will always be fighting some sort of uphill battle for recognition or something like that. I just look at this with my 1960 eyes, and I say, there's no such thing as a homosexual economic program. At all. There's no such thing as a homosexual social worker. At all. That cannot be what this is about. There is no such thing as a women's economic program. There just isn't any such thing. They're not addressing the way that we analyze things. I'm actually sort of wearing two hats here because I'm still, like the communists from the 60s, but at the same time, if I haven't already said it, then I ought to say it, that, the word communism has been so ruined, by the historical experience that I don't see any way to continue using it. I personally don't have any problem with it, but I just feel that the public would not understand what one was talking about. It should be called higher civilization. That's what, to put it mildly, Marx did not come to that point. And we know why. It's because Marx did not invent communism. It was invented in France at the beginning of the 19th century. Marx was actually a latecomer to the communist idea, even though he may have written the most vivid formulations. But communism is definitely big in France around 1800. And so, he got that word, and so he ran with that word. But I would say higher civilization. And, I will come back to that momentarily. But to come back to these, the coalition of essential victims, relative to the coalition of essential victims, the majority is the problem. The majority is public enemy number one. Like if you had told us that in 1963, our jaws would have dropped. We wouldn't have been able to understand what you're talking about, because the whole premise of communism was that somehow that, in other words, we're going to entitle the majority. In other words, that kind of language is carried over in this sort of this 1% nonsense. The Occupy Wall Street nonsense. But that the 1%, well, that's how we really thought. We really thought that, Mao Zedong said it. In other words, the majority of the people in the world are either on our side or should be on our side. And now that has been completely turned upside down. The majority of public enemy number one is a coalition of minorities that basically have no goals in common whatsoever. You simply cannot take, for whatever reason, I'm familiar with I guess what would be called radical African-American political thought in the United States, in the 20th century, but especially the second half of the 20th century. I know what RAM was. How many people in this room have ever heard of RAM? Nobody. Yeah, nobody. It was incredibly important. Yes, well, I was interested in that sort of thing. RAM was a black separatist organization headquartered in Philadelphia, which had as its honorary president Robert F. Williams. Anybody in this room ever heard of him? Raise your hand if you. Okay, two people in this room have heard of him. He was in Peking at the time. He convinced Mao to write, a very prominent article on the situation of African Americans. He was a big deal at that point. He was the honorary president of RAM, which was headquartered in Philadelphia. They also had a secret member. That's very interesting. An organization with secret members. Malcolm X. So, the thing is that you take that. By the way, the leader of RAM, a man named Max Stanford, changed his, he changed his name to an Arabic name, and I assume that he became a Muslim. He is now a professor of sociology at Temple University. He obviously went a long way, but a lot of us did, I guess. There's just no way that you can put that together with gay marriage or something. It just, they're on different planets. But somehow, they are part of a coalition, and obviously, it's not my purpose in this talk to go, to explain what is going on now. But obviously, there's a campaign to change the political order in the United States, and this coalition is supplying a very valuable voting bloc. That's, this is going to be like the automatic yeses, to whatever changes are made in the political order in the United States, at a much higher level. A higher level that civilians do not think about, But as I say, it's not my purpose to talk about that this afternoon. I want to go back to what Marx said he wanted, and what Guevara said he wanted. I cannot resist telling you, by the way, that Guevara has a famous essay, Socialism and Man in Cuba. And I mean, that is just so horrible. I mean, in other words, like it just showed how, you know, I mean, he was just in some kind of a hallucination or something. Because, I mean, he is making socialism specific to Cuba like it was the Mamba. You know, like it was a Cuban cultural statement. You know, I mean, that's so preposterous. I mean, I'm astonished at nobody caught it. But they did. But at any rate, I mean, I want to go back and talk about what these guys said that they wanted. And, you know, as a matter of fact, I mean, you know, like the last thing in this talk was going to be, why should we bother to do that? You know, I mean, in other words, like, why is that even an interesting topic? Because, but I mean, just to begin, I mean, I can tell you this, don't think left. You know, don't think Marx, think science fiction, because that's what it is. I mean, if you took this seriously, it would be science fiction. And, I mean, the attitude would have to be different, because, you know, Marx was intoxicated with moral indignation. And, you know, I mean, this has to happen, or else there is no justice in the world, and so forth. I mean, that's just not the right way to think about this. I mean, this is a problem of, it's a science fiction problem. I mean, it's science fiction without the story. I mean, the question is, you know, like whether you can actually write, you know, like, you know, a set of assumptions, a set of premises, you know, within which framework, you know, a social order would be possible that would do what Marx said that he wanted, which is like, in other words, there are no more markets, there's no more money. I mean, goods are not valued in money. There's no exchange of goods. I mean, basically, people provision themselves. I mean, there would be like many avenues by which people could provision themselves. I mean, including making it for themselves. That would be, in that case, you would have to requisition the supplies in order to make something. If you wanted to cook your own food, you would requisition the supplies. I mean, if you wanted to eat food that was already prepared, I mean, you know, there are many different, you know, cafeterias, you know, I mean, all the way up to and including, I mean, we have to talk about what the technological level is. I mean, it might be just a question of having, you know, something that looks like a big, I mean, the thing might, I mean, it might look like a big microwave oven, and you might just dial what you would want, and it would appear there by teleportation. I mean, it would be a teleportation drone. You know. I mean, you know, I can't tell you exactly what it would look like until you tell me what is technologically available. I mean, you would go over to robot factories. I mean, they're already talking about them. I have a photograph of the Tesla factory in California. And, I mean, I doubt that it's 100% robotic. But it certainly, you know, I mean, the shop floor is absolutely crowded with machines. I mean, you know, like if there are any people there, then they would just be sort of darting around between the enormous machines, which I assume do all the work. But I mean, they are talking about 100% robot factories in Japan. You see, I mean, for capitalism, that's a tragedy. Because that means then that all the workers will be fired. And because it's capitalism, that means then that, okay, they're fired. They don't have a job. Okay, then they have no way of making money. If they have no money, then they can't buy their subsistence, their provisions. So they would all die. I mean, that's the capitalist answer. I mean, that's why, you know, I mean, that's why you go back into union history and you will see that unions were frightened of automation. For the reason that I mean, they wanted to hold technology back in order to make sure that that Joe Kroll, got his pay packet, so he could pay the rent and buy food. I mean, and the idea that you would sort of get rid of those factories, the lathes and drill presses and everything, because they're no longer needed. I mean, they're not actually needed. And then you could just sort of let the machines make everything. I mean, that's absolute tragedy for capitalism. I mean, maybe you will understand a little better if I tell you, I mean, the first principle of capitalist economics, I don't know how many people in this room have taken a single college economics course in their lives. Okay, 2 people. Looks like two people. Was your textbook Samuelson? Was it the Samuelson textbook? No, you don't remember. Okay, that was the go-to textbook back in the day. Well, I mean, Samuelson does not tell you what the first law of capitalism is. And the first law of capitalism is that the only right that you have is the right to die immediately. That's the first law of capitalism. I mean, if you have nothing to sell, then very well, here's a spot in the gutter. You may lay down and die. Be my guest. That's the first law of capitalism. They don't tell that to the beginners. You only get that when you're well along in graduate study. I mean, there's actually a name for it, the zero trade vector. The zero trade vector. In other words, a person who has nothing, nothing but the zero trade vector. I mean, he gives nothing, he gets nothing. You die immediately. Obviously there are a lot of buffers to prevent it from coming to this. I mean, that's what the Robin Hood is about. That's what stealing from the rich and giving to the poor is about. So it won't become acute like this. I mean, you will just have this ethnic group living on charity. But I mean, that prevents it from becoming acute. I mean, if you didn't have those transfers, then they would simply die. I mean, the question is, as I say, whether you could write a set of premises relative to which this would be possible. And I mean, that is, I think that I've made a large contribution to that, and I actually gave you a piece of paper, the one that has Guevara on the other side, which is devoted to that question. But, to get serious about that, I mean, this is real science fiction. I mean, in other words, like you would need intellectual solutions that have never been heard of. I mean, the people, actually designing this would be making up the science that they were using to design it as they went. That's the point that I want to make. The engineering and economics textbooks in the library now are saturated with capitalist behavioral rules. They're saturated with it. I mean, their textbooks on how to make a profit. Not only economics, but engineering. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when you get an engineering textbook on operations research, I mean, the point is making a profit. And, all of that would have to go. I mean, in other words, like the algorithm or algorithms could not be profit-driven. I mean, there wouldn't even be any system. You have to completely rethink it. In addition to that, you see, there's something else that I just had on the tip of my tongue. Yes. You would have to have, like some, the vantage point of the apex, which could see the entire economy whole. That would be the case. That would be necessary. But, the idea that, some, director or commander sort of sitting in the director's chair, sort of up at the top of the social pyramid, is going to tell everybody else in a society of 1 billion people, whatever, what to do. I mean, of course, this is insane. It's insane. You couldn't possibly. What you have to do is that you have to build the possibility of sort of the individual discretion into the algorithm, and it has to mesh, with what the apex sees and with what the apex wants to happen. It has to. This is also a mathematical problem. And, nobody has even thought about it, much less solved it. And then you have like the entire sort of, the whole panorama of human relations. Because, in the first place, there is not going to be rank signaled by differential consumption. If there were, it wouldn't be a real communism. It wouldn't be honestly. That means that, just for the moment, people are going to eat in cafeterias, the psychiatrist, the psychiatrist, the elevator repairman, if there is one, the psychiatrist, the theoretical physicist, and the director of the global committee, whatever and so forth. They're all eating in the same cafeteria. If that were not the case, if you had, what in the army they call them messes. If you had messes according to rank, it wouldn't be communism at all, not remotely. So you can't do that. But in other words, like, how are you going to have? It is essentially expert. So how are you going to have? You have to have the experts. The experts have to accredit each other. There has to be some kind of political, avenue. There has to be what we would call representative government or something like that. How is that all going to happen? You have to assume that at that point that nations would no longer exist. Because it just doesn't make sense. Nations. This is going back to Jabbar. The idea that socialism could be just a Cuban cultural ornament or something. That's preposterous. The last, I want to wind it up. So, the last thing there are two further questions. Once you understand what we're talking about, you understand that it's science fiction. It might not be possible. I don't guarantee that it's possible. It should be carried through as a thought experiment. The objections to it, like the idea that we have passed the point of no return ecological, for example, those objections should be carefully listed and addressed. They shouldn't be swept under the rug. Because, we aren't trying to win the argument. We're trying to make it. Now, who in the society is going to want this? In other words, to use the old terminology, who is going to be the revolutionary protagonist? I will just leave that as I'm not going to take any more time, so I'll have to leave that as an open question. I have a little bit about this on my website, under the, somewhere down towards the bottom of the website. But, it's a deep question. It cannot be brushed off at all. And then, once you have some kind of official, people get together on a reviewing stand or something and say, okay, now this is day one. This is day one of the new mode of production. Terrific. But, everything is still being done the way it was done before. I mean, just, call this thing and day one is here. It's not going to make a single factory vanish, or a single truck carrying tomatoes. I mean, the truck is still going to be carrying tomatoes, I mean, in other words, like you have to have an economic transition, that rotates the institutions. I mean, that is a profound problem. I thought that I'd said something about that in my PhD dissertation in 1978, but, I look back now and I think it was probably much too easy, But, I mean, that also, I mean, well, the thing is, that like, I don't know if any of you has heard of so-called Spartacus or the International Communist League. It's a splinter group. They have somebody, I mean, their head theoretician is named Joseph Seymour, and he had an article on how will socialism work, and it was just a description of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, basically. That was what he told people. How is socialism going to work? And he called, like he just described the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Oh, I mean, gee, didn't even know that the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, these guys are so totally clueless. It's just incredible. But, you could not simply shrug off the Soviet Union in the 20s because you would have to, sift through it very carefully for evidence of how, like, you start with what we have now, and you start trying to turn away from it. And, I mean, it can't be instantaneous. I mean, they thought that they were brilliant they nationalized everything, right down to the contents of safe deposit boxes. So, I mean, they thought they were, but I mean, they had this totally crackpot idea that, I want to sort of already told you, I won't go any further into why it's crackpot. Maybe this is a good time to wrap it up.